On the afternoon of May 19, 1875, Mary Todd Lincoln, widow of the 16th President of the United States, answered a knock at her door in Chicago's Grand Pacific Hotel and was informed that she would stand trial for her sanity in 1 hour. The case against her had been assembled, without her knowledge, by Robert Todd Lincoln, her firstborn, her only surviving child. The jury had already been seated. 17 witnesses had already been subpoenaed. Her defense attorney had already been hired, not by her, because she did not yet know a trial existed, but by the side that was prosecuting her. And according to newspaper accounts filed in Chicago that same evening, sewn into the pocket of her dress were $56,000 in government bonds, the equivalent of roughly $1.4 million today, a detail the prosecution would dwell on, and one possible motive for why the trial was happening at all. History filed that afternoon under one convenient word: madness. The official account, the one that settled into the textbooks and stayed there for a century, says that a troubled, grieving woman was placed reluctantly and tenderly somewhere she could be cared for, and that her son did a painful thing because it had to be done. What the record shows is something narrower and colder. This is the story of a jury selected before the defendant knew she was accused, of physicians who diagnosed a woman they had never once examined, of a deliberation that lasted 10 minutes, of a bottle that a hotel pharmacist swore was laudanum and was not, and why that lie may have saved her life on the very night of her conviction. Of letters smuggled out of an asylum to the one woman in Illinois who had passed the bar examination and been refused a license to practice purely because she was a woman, and of a single furious letter written 13 months after the verdict in which Mary Lincoln told her son, in writing, exactly what she believed he had done to her. There is one more detail, and it almost never survives the retellings. The law that put her in that courtroom had been written 8 years earlier, specifically to protect women like her. How a shield became the instrument comes later, because the way it failed Mary Lincoln is the way it failed hundreds of women whose names nobody bothered to record. She was born Mary Ann Todd on December 13, 1818, in Lexington, Kentucky, into a family that owned slaves, entertained senators, and expected its daughters to be ornamental. Her father was a banker who served 6 terms in the Kentucky legislature. Her mother died when she was 6. Her father remarried within 2 years, and Mary became one of 16 children in a blended household where affection was distributed unevenly. The Todds sent her to Madame Mantel's boarding school for roughly 10 years, an exceptional education in an era when most girls of even wealthy families received perhaps 3 or 4 years of formal instruction. Lessons were conducted partly in French, and Mary became fluent enough to read Racine and Molière in the original, a skill she would later deploy in Washington drawing rooms, where European diplomats were startled to find a Kentucky-born First Lady who could discuss Victor Hugo without a translator. She read the newspapers the way other girls of her circle read novels, and she argued politics at dinner tables, where Henry Clay was an occasional guest. In 1839, she moved to Springfield, Illinois, into the household of her sister Elizabeth Edwards, whose husband, Ninian, was the son of a former Illinois governor and one of the most prominent men in the young capital city. And in the parlor of that house, on November 4, 1842, she married a gangly, debt-ridden, melancholy lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, over the loud disapproval of the Todds, who saw only his one-room cabin origins and his debts. He gave her a ring engraved with 3 words: "Love is eternal." Her sister's parlor, the room where the vows were spoken, will return at the end of this story, because Mary Todd Lincoln's life had a terrible symmetry to it, and the house in Springfield sits at both ends of it. For nearly 2 decades, by the accounts of the people who watched the marriage up close, Mary was her husband's sharpest political asset. She read the papers he did not have time for. She knew which editors leaned Republican and which ones could be turned. She managed his image before the word existed. When he lost the Senate race to Stephen Douglas in 1858, it was Mary who insisted the debates be published in book form, preserving the speeches that would make Lincoln a national figure. She pushed when he drifted. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner and eventual biographer, despised her, called her a she-devil and a hellcat, and his posthumous memoir poisoned her reputation for generations. But even Herndon admitted that she understood her husband's potential when Lincoln himself did not. Hold that image of her, the intelligence, the ambition, the money she would one day sew into her clothes. Because 33 years after the wedding, all of it would be turned against her in a Chicago courtroom she was given 1 hour's notice to enter. And then the losses began, and they did not stop for 20 years. In February of 1850, their son Eddie died a month short of his 4th birthday, probably of pulmonary tuberculosis, though the death certificate said only consumption. Mary was pregnant with their 3rd son, Willie, when Eddie was buried. The grief was profound, but it was private, contained within the Springfield house where neighbors brought food and spoke in low voices. In the White House, everything was public, and she was attacked from every direction at once. Kentucky-born, with half-brothers who fought and died for the Confederacy, she was called a traitor in the Northern press and a turncoat in the Southern one. The accusations were specific and relentless. In 1861, the Judiciary Committee investigated whether she had passed military intelligence to Confederate agents. No evidence was ever produced, but the suspicion lingered, amplified by the fact that her half-sister Emily Todd Helm had married a Confederate general. When she overspent the congressional appropriation for refurbishing a shabby, tobacco-stained executive mansion, the overrun became a national scandal in the middle of a war. Congress had authorized $20,000 to repair a building that had been neglected since the Monroe administration, and Mary spent nearly $7,000 more on French wallpaper, new carpets, and a state dinner service, because she believed the White House, as the symbol of the Union, should not look like a boarding house. Lincoln was furious. He told the Commissioner of Public Buildings that he would never approve the overrun, that it would stink in the nostrils of the American people to have it said that the President of the United States had approved a bill overrunning an appropriation of $20,000 for this damned old house when the soldiers cannot have blankets. The commissioner went to Congress behind Lincoln's back, and the money was quietly buried in a contingency fund. But the papers got the story, and Mary was pilloried as extravagant, frivolous, and unpatriotic. Then, on February 20th, 1862, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln died of typhoid fever upstairs in that same mansion, and something in his mother's grief frightened the people around her. She did not attend the funeral. She could not enter the room where Willie had died. For weeks, she remained in bed, weeping, and when she finally emerged, she began consulting spiritualists, hoping to contact her dead son. Elizabeth Keckley, her dressmaker and closest confidant, later wrote in her 1868 memoir that the president led his wife to a window pointed toward the government asylum visible in the distance and told her to try to control her grief or it would drive her mad and they might have to send her there. Whether the exchange happened exactly that way, only Keckley recorded it. But it is worth holding in the mind because 13 years later, the sentence came true, and it was not her husband who sent her. Spiritualism in the 1860s was not the fringe practice it would later become. Millions of Americans, traumatized by the war's carnage, sought comfort in mediums and seances. Mary attended several in the Red Room of the White House, and the newspapers, when they learned of it, added spiritualism to the list of her failings. On April 14, 1865, Mary Lincoln sat beside her husband at Ford's Theater, holding his hand, when John Wilkes Booth fired a single shot into the back of his head. His blood was on her dress. She never wore the dress again, and she never fully recovered from what she witnessed. And in July of 1871, her youngest son, Tad, the last child who still lived with her, died at 18 of what was probably tuberculosis or heart failure, though the exact cause was never confirmed. She had buried 3 of her 4 sons and held her husband as he was dying. Robert was what remained. The years between Tad's death and the trial are the years the prosecution would later mine. The record shows a woman terrified of poverty, despite an estate that the ledgers said should have comforted her. Abraham Lincoln died without a will, leaving roughly $110,000 to be divided among his widow and 2 sons, equivalent to about $2.8 million in today's currency. And Congress, after a long and openly contemptuous debate, voted her a pension of $3,000 a year in 1870, the same amount it had granted the widow of James Polk 2 decades earlier. Several congressmen argued that she did not deserve even that, given the scandal over the White House furnishings and her perceived Confederate sympathies. The pension was not enough to quiet her. In 1867, she had tried to sell her old gowns and jewelry through brokers in New York under an assumed name, and when the press discovered it, the mockery was national, sustained, and merciless. The old clothes scandal, the papers called it. The New York World ran the story under the headline, "Mrs. Lincoln's Second-Hand Clothing," and cartoonists depicted her as a peddler hawking rags. She had hoped to raise money discreetly to supplement her income, but the dealers she worked with leaked the story to the press, possibly for publicity. The humiliation drove her deeper into seclusion. She traveled restlessly, spending time in Germany, Scotland, and Italy, moving from city to city without settling anywhere. She consulted spiritualists, which was less exotic in the 1870s than it sounds now, but which read badly in a courtroom. And in the spring of 1875, wintering in Florida, she became convinced, suddenly and without cause, that Robert was gravely ill in Chicago. She telegraphed his law office repeatedly and boarded the train north. She found him perfectly healthy. She stayed at the Grand Pacific Hotel, and she carried her securities, tens of thousands of dollars in bonds, on her person, sewn into her clothing, as the trial testimony in the Chicago press would soon describe, because she trusted no bank and, increasingly, no one. The hotel staff noticed. She wandered the halls at night. She told the maids that someone was trying to poison her coffee. She said the city was on fire, though no one else smelled smoke. She believed a stranger had touched her forehead and removed her bones, an episode that sounds like a tactile hallucination, and that witnesses would later describe in court with clinical precision. What the record shows next is not a family drifting toward a sad decision. It is an operation. Robert Todd Lincoln, then 31, a rising corporate lawyer with a name that opened every door in Chicago, hired Pinkerton detectives to follow his mother through the city. The Pinkerton Agency, founded by Allen Pinkerton in 1850, had protected Abraham Lincoln during the war and investigated Confederate spies. Now its agents trailed Mary Lincoln and filed reports on her movements, her purchases, her conversations. He consulted a panel of physicians, at least some of whom, by their own later admissions, formed their medical opinions of Mary Lincoln in conversation with Robert, without ever conducting any formal psychiatric examination of the woman herself. The physicians included Dr. Charles Gilman Smith, Dr. Ralph Isham, Dr. Nathan Smith Davis, and Dr. James Stewart Jewell, all respectable Chicago practitioners. Jewell would later testify that he had observed Mary Lincoln from a distance, but had never spoken to her. Smith had attended her briefly years earlier, but had not seen her recently. The diagnoses were assembled from second-hand accounts. He retained Leonard Swett, one of his father's oldest courtroom allies, to manage the legal machinery. Swett had known Abraham Lincoln since the 1850s, had campaigned for him, and had been offered a cabinet post, which he declined. He was among the most skilled trial lawyers in Illinois, and he brought that skill to bear on a widow who had not hired him. And the fullest account of that machinery comes not from Mary's defenders, but from Swett himself, in a letter he wrote to Judge David Davis within days of the trial. A letter that survives and reads less like a memoir than a field report. Davis, another old Lincoln intimate, had been appointed to the Supreme Court by Lincoln in 1862 and had served as executor of Lincoln's estate. Swett's letter to Davis, dated May 24, 1875, describes the trial as a matter of necessity, conducted with care. But the details Swett includes are what matter. The witnesses were arranged in advance. The jury was arranged in advance. The defense attorney, Isaac Arnold, an old Lincoln family friend who had served in Congress during the war and written an early biography of Lincoln, was selected by Robert's side. And when Arnold hesitated at the assignment, Swett's own account records that he pressed Arnold to stay, warning that a real defense might put into her head the idea that she could get off. Read that again. Her own lawyer was warned against defending her. The trial convened at 2 o'clock that same afternoon, May 19th, in the Cook County Courthouse, before Judge Marion Wallace and a jury of 12 men, all men, because the law permitted nothing else. Mary Lincoln had learned of its existence roughly an hour earlier. 17 witnesses testified. Hotel maids and waiters and a cashier described her fears that the city was burning, that a stranger meant to poison her, that voices spoke through the walls. A hotel chambermaid named Catherine Burke testified that Mrs. Lincoln had tried to flee the hotel in her nightgown, convinced the building was on fire. The hotel cashier testified that she had tried to withdraw large sums repeatedly, then returned the money hours later, only to attempt the same transaction again the next day. A physician named Willis Danforth, who had actually treated her, described hallucinations. Then came the doctors who had never met her, offering diagnoses built from Robert's descriptions. Dr. Charles Gilman Smith testified that, in his opinion, based on what he had been told, Mrs. Lincoln was insane and should be confined. Dr. Ralph Isham concurred. Dr. Nathan Smith Davis, one of the founders of the American Medical Association, testified that he had observed her from a hotel window and believed her insane. No formal psychiatric examination of Mary Lincoln was ever conducted, before or during the trial. The testimony lasted 3 hours. Then came Robert. He told the jury, in words the Chicago papers printed the next morning, that he had no doubt his mother was insane, that she had long been a source of great anxiety to him. He described the bonds sewn into her clothing, her fears of poverty, her belief that someone was poisoning her. Several accounts say he wept on the stand. The Chicago Tribune reported that his voice broke repeatedly and that spectators in the courtroom were visibly moved. Isaac Arnold, the defense, cross-examined almost no one and called no witnesses of his own. He did not challenge the diagnosis. He did not question the process. He did not call Elizabeth Keckley, who had lived with Mary Lincoln for years and could have testified to her rationality and competence. He did not call her sister, Elizabeth Edwards, who had taken her in after Tad's death and seen no evidence of insanity. He did not call the hotel physician, who might have contextualized her symptoms as grief and trauma rather than madness. The jury retired and returned in 10 minutes. Insane, and a fit person to be confined. In a single afternoon, Mary Lincoln lost her liberty and control of her estate, which passed into a conservatorship, with Robert appointed conservator. One account from the courtroom records her turning to her son and saying, "Oh, Robert, to think that my son would ever have done this." Whether she said precisely those words, the sentiment is confirmed by everything she wrote afterward. Now the bottle. That evening, awaiting transport to the asylum, Mary Lincoln slipped away from the people watching her and went down to the hotel pharmacy. She asked for laudanum, an opium tincture, ostensibly for her nerves. The episode was reported in the Chicago newspapers within days, and it is from those contemporary accounts and the pharmacist's own later telling that the details survive. Laudanum was widely available in the 1870s, sold over the counter, and used for everything from headaches to menstrual cramps to insomnia. It was also lethal in sufficient quantity. The pharmacist, a man whose name appears in some accounts as Samuel Turner, suspicious of a woman whose conviction was already in the evening papers, stalled her, and when she tried other drugstores nearby, word traveled faster than she did. Chicago pharmacists knew one another, and the trial had been news. She was eventually handed a bottle labeled laudanum that contained, by the pharmacist's later account, little more than burnt sugar and water. She drank it and sat waiting to die. Nothing happened. She waited hours, and when dawn came and she was still alive, she realized she had been deceived. On the morning of May 20th, 1875, she was placed on a train to Batavia, Illinois, and admitted to Bellevue Place, a private sanitarium for women of means, run by Dr. Richard Patterson. Patterson was a physician with progressive ideas about treating mental illness. He opposed the brutal restraints and overcrowding common in public asylums. Bellevue Place, which had opened in 1867, housed no more than 20 patients at a time. It was genteel. There were lawns and carriage rides. Patients were encouraged to read, to walk, to occupy themselves with needlework and music. There were also locked doors, watched correspondence, and the settled understanding that everything she did would now be read through the verdict. This is the trap that the label of madness builds, and the Bellevue records show it operating with perfect efficiency. If she raged at her confinement, that was mania. If she was calm and lucid, that was cunning, the deceptive composure of the insane. The most famous widow in America, a woman who had run the White House, now required permission to walk to the gate. She was confined for a little under 4 months. It should have been years, and for most women in her position, it would have been, because the machine that put her there had no reverse gear. The Illinois statute required a jury trial for commitment, but it said nothing about release. A woman, once declared insane, could be held indefinitely on the word of the asylum superintendent. Patterson's reports to Robert were optimistic in tone, but non-committal in substance. He wrote that Mrs. Lincoln was improving, but that she remained fragile, that she required continued supervision, that premature release would be dangerous. What Mary Lincoln did next is the part of her story that the tragic retellings flatten, and it deserves to be stated plainly. She fought her way out, and she did it with the only weapons left to her, which were a pen, a postage stamp, and a precise understanding of whom to write. Evading Dr. Patterson's supervision of her mail, by routes the record leaves partly obscure, she got letters out of Bellevue to Myra Bradwell of Chicago and to Myra's husband, Judge James Bradwell. The choice was not sentimental. Myra Bradwell had passed the Illinois bar examination in 1869 with high marks and been refused a license by the Illinois Supreme Court on the sole ground that she was a married woman, a refusal the United States Supreme Court upheld in 1873 in a decision that has since become a landmark of judicial sexism. Justice Joseph Bradley, concurring, wrote that the natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. Myra Bradwell was, in 1875, the most formidable almost lawyer in America. Editor of the Chicago Legal News, which she had founded in 1868, and which became one of the most influential legal journals in the Midwest. She was a woman with every personal reason to distrust what male juries decided about female minds. The Bradwells came to Batavia. Myra came back in August with a journalist, Frank Wilkie of the Chicago Times, who interviewed Mary Lincoln at length and reported to his readers that he had found her entirely sane. Wilkie's article, published in August of 1875, described a composed, articulate woman who spoke intelligently about politics and current events, who had no delusions, who expressed entirely rational frustration with her confinement. Dr. Patterson defended the confinement in print, writing a letter to the Chicago Tribune in which he stated that Mrs. Lincoln's apparent sanity was a common feature of her type of insanity, that she was skilled at concealing her symptoms, and that only constant supervision had prevented her from harming herself. The Bradwells kept pushing. Myra wrote editorials in the legal news, questioning the process that had committed her. Judge James Bradwell, who did have a law license, began making discreet inquiries about the legal mechanisms for overturning the verdict. The story turned, and with it the pressure on Robert, whose position was becoming untenable in exactly the arena he feared most: the newspapers. The Chicago papers began running pieces questioning whether Mary Lincoln's confinement was truly necessary, or whether it was, as Myra Bradwell suggested, a means of controlling an inconvenient woman and her money. On September 11, 1875, not quite 4 months after her 10-minute trial, Mary Lincoln walked out of Bellevue Place and into the custody of her sister Elizabeth Edwards in the Springfield house where she had been married. She was out, but she was not free. The verdict still stood, and the conservatorship still stood, which meant her son still controlled her money, her bonds, her property, her signature. It took another 9 months of quiet campaigning by the Bradwells and the Edwards family before a second jury convened in Cook County on June 15, 1876, and formally declared Mary Lincoln restored to reason. The second trial was brief and pro forma. No witnesses testified against her. Robert did not attend. The jury deliberated for 6 minutes and returned a verdict of sanity restored. The conservatorship dissolved. Her estate came back to her. And 4 days later, on June 19th, she sat down and wrote Robert a letter that survives in her own hand, a letter that historians have been flinching at ever since. She itemized the possessions she wanted returned, the paintings that had belonged to her husband, the silver service given to them as a wedding gift, the jewelry. She demanded the return of 2 trunks that Robert had placed in storage, one containing her husband's papers and one containing her own correspondence. And she told him, in a line that requires no interpretation, that he had tried his game of robbery long enough, and that she now understood his motives had been entirely financial. That was her verdict on the trial, delivered 13 months after his verdict on her. And unlike the jury, she had needed no one to arrange her witnesses. What followed was exile, self-imposed and unbending. She sailed for France in October of 1876 and settled in the resort town of Pau, near the Pyrenees, where she lived 4 years in modest rooms among strangers, which she appears to have preferred to living among family who had testified about her. Pau was a quiet town favored by British and American expatriates seeking a mild climate and low cost of living. Mary rented rooms in a pension, took her meals alone, and avoided society. She wrote letters to her sister and to her granddaughter, but she did not write to Robert. Her health broke down. A fall from a stepladder in 1879 injured her spine, and by 1880 she was going blind by degrees, probably from cataracts, though the exact diagnosis is not recorded. She sailed home that October, and Sarah Bernhardt, who was aboard the same ship and wrote about it in her memoirs, described catching a frail American widow who had nearly fallen down a staircase, and learning afterward whose life she had saved. Bernhardt was crossing the Atlantic to begin an American tour, and she later told reporters in New York that she had been deeply moved to meet the widow of the great Lincoln, and that she had been shocked by how frail and forgotten she seemed. Mary returned to the Edwards house in Springfield and kept the shades drawn. She rarely left her room. Her eyesight continued to fail, and she could no longer read or sew, the two occupations that had given her comfort. In May of 1881, Robert visited, bringing his young daughter, named Mary, after her. The record of that meeting is thin, and the word reconciliation is probably heavier than the evidence will bear, but she received him. Elizabeth Edwards later told an interviewer that the visit was strained and brief, that Mary was polite but distant, and that Robert left after less than an hour. On July 16, 1882, at 63, Mary Todd Lincoln died in her sister's house, one floor above the parlor where, 40 years earlier, a lawyer had put a ring on her finger engraved with the words, "Love is eternal." By most accounts, she was buried wearing it. Her estate, when inventoried, totaled $84,000, the equivalent of over $2 million today, a sum that made nonsense of the poverty she had feared, but that she had never been able to believe was real. Robert Todd Lincoln lived until 1926. He became Secretary of War under Presidents Garfield and Arthur, Minister to Great Britain under Benjamin Harrison, and President of the Pullman Company, one of the most powerful corporations in America. He was present at 3 presidential assassinations, a fact that later biographers found grimly symbolic. He was in the room when his father died. He was at the train station when President Garfield was shot in 1881. He was standing near President McKinley when McKinley was shot in 1901. He never publicly revisited the events of May 1875. When journalists asked him about his mother, he declined to comment. When historians approached him for interviews or access to family papers, he refused. He gathered the papers that touched on the episode, and he kept them. For a century, the fullest documentary record of what was done to Mary Lincoln sat locked away among his files at his Vermont estate, Hildene, in a bundle concerning his mother's case, and it did not come to light until 1975, 100 years after the trial, when it was found at the house and eventually became the foundation of the modern scholarship on the case, including the work of Mark Neely and Gerald McMurtry, whose book, The Insanity File, published in 1986, was the first to print the full trial transcript and Swett's letters. The man controlled the story in life, and very nearly controlled it in death. And here the shield returns, the detail promised at the beginning. The reason Mary Lincoln received a jury trial at all was an 1867 Illinois statute, won almost single-handedly by a woman named Elizabeth Packard, a minister's wife whose husband Theophilus, a Calvinist, decided that her progressive religious views were evidence of insanity, and who, under the Illinois law of the time, could commit his wife to an asylum without proof, without a hearing, simply by requesting it. In June of 1860, he did. Elizabeth Packard spent 3 years in the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane at Jacksonville, released not because the doctors declared her sane, but because the hospital needed the bed. She spent the rest of her life writing books and lobbying legislatures, and in 1867, largely because of her efforts, Illinois passed the first law requiring a jury trial before commitment, notice to the accused, and testimony under oath. It was hailed as a triumph of progressive reform. 8 years later, the law Packard built was satisfied to the letter in a Chicago courtroom. There was a jury, there was a defense attorney, there was testimony under oath. Every safeguard was present, and every safeguard had been arranged in advance by the petitioner, so that the machinery built to protect Mary Lincoln became, instead, the theater of her condemnation. The form of justice was perfect. Only the substance was missing. Whether Mary Todd Lincoln was mentally ill remains genuinely argued. Jean Baker, her most careful modern biographer, reads the evidence with deep skepticism toward the diagnosis. Baker's book, Mary Todd Lincoln, published in 1987, argues that the symptoms described by witnesses were consistent with severe grief, chronic pain from migraines, and what may have been undiagnosed diabetes, and the rational fear of poverty from a woman who had watched Congress debate whether she deserved a pension and who had been humiliated in the national press for trying to sell her clothes. Baker notes that none of the physicians who testified ever conducted a formal examination, that the standard diagnostic criteria of the time were vague and heavily gendered, and that the verdict was predetermined by a process designed to produce only one outcome. Others note real symptoms, the fears, the voices the hotel staff described, the incident in which she believed her bones had been removed, and suggest an ailing woman badly served rather than a sane woman framed. Dr. Myra Himmelhoek and Dr. Arthur Himmelhoek, writing in the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society in 1975, argue that Mary Lincoln likely suffered from pernicious anemia, or a related neurological disorder that can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive decline, and that her symptoms might have been treatable had anyone bothered to investigate the medical rather than the legal question. The record can sustain either reading, and this episode has not pretended otherwise. But the question the trial answered was never really the question the trial asked. 12 men were asked whether a woman was insane. What they actually decided, in 10 minutes, was that a difficult, grieving, embarrassing, inconveniently wealthy widow could be removed, and that the removal could be called mercy. History accepted the word for 100 years because her son was respectable and she was not, and because madness has always been the cheapest available explanation for a woman who will not be managed. She got out. Most of them did not. The part that lingers is not the injustice, which was ordinary for its time, but the excusing of it afterward, decade after decade, by people who had read the verdict and never once read the letters. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because the record on these women runs deeper than the official accounts ever admitted. And a like helps this episode reach the people who think they already know how it ends.